So what are the Russians and Ukrainians up to again? Russia has significantly exceeded the planned deficit for the entire year. Yes, even though they have high oil prices, they also have a strong ruble, and that's ruining everything for them. We'll explain how it works, but mainly we'll also look at the fact that Russia is extremely behind on wage payments. So we'll cover all of this. We'll look at the economic overview. And of course, don't worry, I'll also talk about how things are in Ukraine or in Europe, because I've taken your long-standing criticism to heart that whenever I talk about Russian problems, I don't mention that Ukraine sometimes has similar or even worse problems. It seemed to me like carrying coals to Newcastle because I thought it was obvious to everyone that Ukraine would be much worse off on its own, since it's a smaller, weaker, poorer country. It's been attacked, and there's a war going on in its territory, while Russia doesn't have a war on most of its own territory. So it seemed a bit unnecessary to me. And at the same time, it seemed a bit unnecessary to me because we kind of know that whenever Ukraine has a problem, the European Union or someone else comes and tries to help solve it. So in this regard, it's like comparing apples and oranges. Nevertheless, let's get to it. If you want to know more, keep watching. But let's start with the fact that Russia's war expenses this year will exceed the budget by at least 2 trillion rubles. So I would actually start by explaining that the Russian war economy is really running at full speed right now. And it seems to me that a lot of people, especially in the comments, always argue that the Russian economy is in a wartime state, that it can withstand anything. It's a strong economy that at this moment, when it's in a wartime state, can hold out for an extremely long time. And of course, I agree here that a war economy is a resilient economy, but at the same time, it seems to me that a lot of people perceive it as if the war economy is some kind of cheat code, that it's something you just use and suddenly you automatically become stronger, better, and it doesn't cost anything. But that's not how it is, right? A war economy isn't some kind of great economy. A war economy is actually a disaster. You don't want a war economy because a war economy basically means that, sure, it gives you low unemployment, it gives you weapons, and it gives people jobs and money, of course, but at the same time, it kills the civilian side of the economy, the consumer side, the part that actually matters most. Because at that moment, the money shifts from the civilian sector to the military sector. And as soon as there's less money, as soon as the cash flow gets worse, and as soon as the foundations of stability are disrupted, that's when companies start falling behind on wages, and that's a problem. Yes, so Russia does have a war economy. Meanwhile, we don't have a war economy here. We're still managing to rearm, even if not perfectly, and at the same time, we're still making mixers, iPhones, and handbags. Yeah, and at the same time, of course, it's important to say that Ukraine also has a fully fledged war economy, but the issue there, or rather the advantage, is that we are backing them, we who make those handbags and cars and all those things. And whenever Ukraine needs something, we always somehow come to an agreement, give them some money, or at least help keep them afloat, even if it's not exactly solving the problem for them, but at least we help them get through it. So in this regard, that's the comparison of those economies. Russia and Ukraine, of course, are both running war economies. In Ukraine, they're managing to keep things basically stable, mainly because we are backing them. In Russia, of course, it's more problematic because the problems are already starting to show there. And now about the actual salaries, before we get to why the Russian budget is having problems because of the high ruble exchange rate and why oil isn't helping them. So, the unpaid salaries. Right now, there are about 19,000 people in Russia who are waiting for their salaries, and lots of people who aren't getting the salary they should be getting, and a certain amount of debt is building up because of it. The total amount owed in salaries in Russia right now is about 900 million crowns, which is almost 3 billion rubles. And sure, this amount isn't really that high yet. This problem is really only just beginning. Because if we compare it to the 1990s when half the population didn't get paid and received their wages in vodka, this is actually still relatively okay. However, it's 19,000 people waiting for their wages in a system that's supposed to provide people with stability, to give them comfort, if I can put it that way, and in return it wants obedience. But that wouldn't really be a problem if it were just 19,000 people. The problem is the growing trend, because when we look at what the Russian Statistical Office reports, which is basically the source for this article from the Moscow Times, we can see that the increase is in the double digits. It's rising in the double digits and it's still accelerating. That means there is obviously some structural problem behind this. The structural problem we just talked about at the beginning is that the war economy is harming the civilian economy and people aren't getting their paychecks because there isn't enough money in the civilian economy and companies don't have enough orders. Entire segments are dropping by tens of percent and whole sectors of individual businesses are falling by tens of percent. Russia is really entering a deep crisis at this moment, and the problem isn't the current situation. The problem is the established trend. That established trend looks like a snowball that will keep accumulating more and more problems, and soon it won't be 19,000 people waiting for their paychecks, but 1 million people. Simply put, it's an avalanche that's just starting to roll and probably can't be stopped, at least as far as the Russian Federation is concerned and what the state can do. It can't be stopped if the state continues to operate in a wartime economy. And on the contrary, it will only get worse, because if we look at how Russia pays companies that do government contracts, they pay them on credit. They pay them late and say, look, make this for us now, we'll pay you later. And when they finally pay them later, it's often much later. And by then, inflation has eaten up the value, so they don't pay them as much as they should. And since it's not adjusted for inflation, those companies are at a big loss, often a very big loss. So in this regard, this is a problem. It's a problem, and even though it's not like the 90s yet, it could soon become like the 90s if the Russian state doesn't do something about it, if it doesn't pull the emergency brake, end the war, and start functioning normally again as a civilized country, which doesn't seem likely to happen. But when we look at Ukraine, which is of course under attack and in a much worse situation, it's also in a much worse situation in terms of how many people aren't getting paid. Because right now, there are about 36,000 unpaid salaries. And if we look at this graph here, I can even make it bigger for you. We can see that the number of people is increasing. It's increasing. And over the past year, it has really jumped a lot. So even Ukraine has a problem, quite a big problem with how many people aren't getting their salaries or aren't getting them in the amount they should be. And at the same time, the state also owes money to companies for supplying goods or services so that when these companies deliver to the state, they get paid. So the problem in Ukraine is actually exactly the same, and structurally and proportionally even worse than in Russia. But the problem is that in Russia, they try to pretend that nothing is happening, that everything is fine, that the economy is growing, and people keep saying in the comments that, oh, Russia's GDP is growing. Well, it's nice that Russia's GDP is growing, but when there are thousands of people here who aren't getting paid, that's probably not a healthy economy, and it's not really a healthy thing. Yeah? No one doubts that Ukraine's economy is screwed. We all know that. Yeah, so that's why we're mostly talking about Russia here, because Russia is the country that doesn't have a war on its own territory and doesn't have to fight that war. Whereas Ukraine, since it's been attacked and is defending itself, has to fight the war. Yeah. So in this respect, it's probably understandable that a country where an active war is being fought on its territory has problems. Yeah, and it's gonna have it worse than a country where the war isn't being fought and that started the war because it thought it was prepared for it and thought it could achieve something by doing so. And all of this brings us to the fact that Putin's war keeps getting more expensive. This year, Russia will overspend its budget by at least 2 trillion rubles, So, of course, it keeps getting more expensive. We have to put it into some context. The context is that right now, the deficit is just under 6 trillion rubles, but it's still expected that some money might come in, so it could even out a bit, decrease, and balance out. But on the other hand, anything could happen that could throw a wrench into the budget again, right? However, if we look at it in terms of percentages, and looking at budgets and deficits in percentage terms is the only way that makes sense, then right now, Russia is running a deficit of 2.5% of GDP for this year. 2.5% of GDP is actually pretty good. Yeah, if that happened in the Czech Republic, if we had a deficit of 2.5% of GDP for the year, it wouldn't be exactly ideal, right? It wouldn't be exactly great, but we wouldn't be totally freaking out about it either. That's how I'd put it. And in Europe, deficits in relation to GDP are often even higher. The problem, however, is that while we, for example, can finance our deficit by borrowing from another country or from others, we can simply borrow. Russia, because of the situation it's in, has somewhat more limited options for borrowing. That's the first problem. The second problem is that Russia doesn't use its budget deficit for a nice welfare state or to make people feel good. It doesn't spend it on investments. It spends a large part of it on the war. But, and this is the most important thing, the trend is terrible. Yeah, because year on year, the Russian state's spending increased by almost 16%. So spending went up by almost 16% while revenues dropped by 4.5% year on year. And it's going to get even worse because all these problems we've talked about, which are only just starting now and will continue to pile up more issues, aren't even fully reflected in the numbers yet. So the war is getting brutally expensive, and even though there are some larger oil revenues, it's not that much of a windfall because the Russian ruble is getting stronger. Sure, you might be thinking, what kind of nonsense is that? How come it's a bad thing that the Russian ruble is getting stronger? That shouldn't be helping Russia, right? If the ruble is stronger, isn't a strong currency usually good? It's not. It's not. And look at why China, Japan, and other extremely export-oriented economies don't want to have too strong a currency. A strong currency doesn't benefit exports at all, and it definitely doesn't benefit oil and natural gas exports. Let's look at it a bit mathematically. Yeah. Let's imagine we have the ruble at a certain price, okay? The value of the ruble is something. Assume the ruble's value is low. At the moment when the value of the ruble is low, you export oil, and that oil has a value and is paid for in some other currency. Most of the time it's paid in dollars or euros, and often in yuan at this point already. But simply put, if someone wants to buy oil, they have to buy those rubles with some currency. At the moment when that person or that state mainly or that company or someone buys those rubles and the ruble is weak, then suddenly there are a lot of rubles. There are a lot. And so you pay a lot of rubles to the company that's selling you the oil, and then that company subsequently pays a lot of rubles from that pile into the state budget. And that keeps the state budget alive. Whereas when the ruble strengthens, at that moment you get fewer rubles for the same amount of oil because the ruble is stronger compared to another currency. That means you simply get less money. And let's say that a strong currency combined with high oil prices would be fine. It would be good for a normally functioning state, because for a state that wants to do things abroad, sure, but for the Russian state to operate things internally within a ruble-based economy, you need a lot of rubles. Yeah, you don't need a strong ruble, you need a lot of rubles for your people. And that's currently a problematic thing because even though high oil prices are helping the Russian budget, the profits from those high oil prices are being significantly eaten up by the fact that the ruble is strengthening. The ruble would be good, a strong ruble would be good if you wanted to buy something. If Russia wanted to buy things of any kind, to buy from China, from India, or through imports, through re-imports or parallel imports from various other countries. When it comes to Western goods, they'll import it from Kazakhstan, right? At that moment, the Russian ruble is a good thing because Coca-Cola and iPhones are relatively cheaper. But when it comes to the state economy and the war economy, and the fact that you need to have money in an economy that's mainly driven by oil exports, a strong ruble is not a good thing. Yeah, it has to be balanced. It has to be balanced. And right now, it seems, according to Russian oligarchs, the main source of this information, you could say the source of this narrative, according to Russian oligarchs, the current state of the ruble is too strong, and they are pushing the central bank to bring the ruble down. Here we can take a look at the development of the ruble's value compared to the koruna, right? And the thing is, the oligarchs want the ruble's value to be brought down. In other words, so that you could buy more rubles for a Czech koruna than you can now, which would help the state budget. But at the same time, it would accelerate inflation for all imported goods. So you really have to balance. You have to balance between whether you want a strong or a weak currency, because a weak currency supports exports, but at the same time, complicates imports. In other words, it supports exports and the income from exporting, but it makes it harder for people to buy things that are imported from abroad. In other words, that brings us to the war economy after all, doesn't it? And also to this problem with wages and everything else, it's all connected. Because the moment Russia decides to weaken the value of the ruble, it's basically saying, okay, officially the war economy is our top priority, 100%, and any kind of luxury for Russians doesn't matter to us. Yeah, we don't care. And at that moment, more and more problems arise. So right now, Russia actually doesn't have to deal with the problem. Russia doesn't have one clear-cut problem when it comes to the ruble exchange rate, deficits, unemployment, or conversely, labor shortages and unpaid wages. These aren't problems. These are dilemmas. It's not about doing one thing and solving it. No. In all these respects, you can do one thing or the other, and neither is right. Russia, at this moment, in the situation it has found itself in, doesn't have a right solution to the problem. It doesn't have a solution to the problem that would actually lead to a better tomorrow. It can only choose a path. It can choose a path over hills and valleys to hell, or over rivers and forests to hell. But that path leads to hell. That's how it is. Ladies and gentlemen, let me know how you like this video, what you think about the situation and the economy in Russia, whether you prefer a weak or strong currency, all of that. You can support my work through QR codes, join the streams, and I'll see you next time.